Welcome to the FieldLink podcast. I'm your host, Bill Smith. In this episode, we travel to Washington, D.C. to sit down with lawmakers from across our country as we talk about the Farm Bill and other major legislation that's being proposed that could impact growers today. Also joining us is Sean McCarty. Sean is the Director of Government Affairs for Helena. Sean's going to help us break down some of the comments and feedback from several senators, congresswomen and men from across our nation, as well as administrators. Stay tuned for this special episode of FieldLink. Joining me today here on this special episode of FieldLink is Sean McCarty. Sean is the Director of Government Affairs here at Helena in Memphis. Sean, welcome back to Memphis from D.C. It was quite a crazy time out there this week.
Good to see you again. Different time zone, same group.
There we go. Hey, we're here in Memphis today. We've spent the last week out there. I was with the National Association of Farm Broadcasters. You were out, boots on the ground, working with a lot of our entities out there, working Congress, working a lot of those senators to better understand what's going on in the industry. Sean, tell us a little bit about some of the things that you were working on this past week.
Yeah, Bill, for Helena, I represent our government advocacy efforts, and my department does all we can to protect the interests of not only Helena, but our customers at the federal level and at the state level. And so that involves traveling around to all of our state capitals and meeting with folks in the states, but also handling efforts at a national level. And so this past week, there were a lot of folks in town, a variety of different events going on. Part of my week was spent with the fertilizer folks, addressing some of the fertilizer issues that are going on right now and some of the challenges that we've seen over the past few years and how they will fit into the upcoming Farm Bill. And then the other part of the week was working on pesticide issues and some of the non-pesticidal issues on active ingredients that we use, and ensuring that whether those are involved in the Farm Bill or elsewhere, that we come at them from a common sense approach and the voices are heard of the growers and the parts of the country that don't exist in some of these areas where folks just don't see pesticides up front.
You bet, and certainly a lot of policy taking place here. Lots of discussions, lots of hearings going on. Sean, we're going to dive right into a first episode here. We had a segment. I was able to sit down with, along with several other broadcasters, several folks this week. Pete Buttigieg was there, certainly our Secretary of Transportation, and we talked about a lot of things. Transportation logistics is really critical. Let's take a second here and listen to what Pete Buttigieg has to say.
So let me start by talking about what we're doing. Then I'm going to talk about what I'd like to see Congress do. So in terms of what we're doing, from day one, we have stepped up safety audits that were slowed down or withdrawn under the last administration because we think it's very important to look over the shoulders of these freight railroad companies and make sure they're compliant. Since what happened in East Palestine, we have done additional supplemental inspections and safety advisories related to things like wayside defect detectors or hot box detectors. Those are devices that can sense temperature anomalies in the wheels as they pass by, hazardous materials and how they're handled, and other things that we think deserve special attention right now. But I'll say that our hand would be a lot stronger if Congress would strengthen it. And I'll give you an example. Right now, even if we find an egregious hazardous material related violation by a railroad resulting in a fatality, the most we can assess by way of a penalty is in the neighborhood of $250,000. And if you're a multi-billion-dollar corporation like a Norfolk Southern, in my view, that's not enough to really get your attention. That cap is set by Congress. But there is legislation right now, bipartisan legislation, co-sponsored among others by both the Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown and the Republican Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio, which would change that and raise it to a level that would get their attention, in addition to a number of other concrete improvements that would make our railroad safer. The adoption of tank cars, stronger tank cars, a standard called DOT 117, was set by rule to be done by 2025, and then there was an intervention by Congress, and that got slowed down. One of many cases where railroad regulations have either been blocked or watered down in recent years. I think we ought to be doing the reverse. Make them tougher, not weaker. And I think there's a real moment here because America's eyes have been opened to the frequency that these rail disasters are happening. If you look at the overall pattern, The reason that we've been able to see them at a lower level than they were in the year 2000 or in the year 1980, when there were more than 10 derailments per day in America, is enforcement and regulation. I think to go the rest of the way and to deal with the still very high number that we have now, including on average more than one derailment every single day in America, is to follow through and hold the line, even knowing that there is a very powerful freight railroad industry that has often gotten its way in this town. There are indications that this bipartisan legislation I mentioned could move in Congress as early as the next few weeks. And we would enthusiastically support progress on that, because that, again, would strengthen our hand. But with the tools that we have, we're going to do everything we can.
So, John, lots happening there with the Secretary talking about safety, clearly catching a lot of headlines, concerns in supply chain there for all of us. What are your thoughts around some of those regulations that they're considering?
Well, I think, Bill, as you look back, some of these things are efforts that have been worked on across administrations. And oftentimes, it's which administration chooses to really hit the go button versus kick the can down the road. They open things up for comment. They have discussions. The Secretary mentioned working with Congress and trying to get a bipartisan initiative launched. It really comes down to what do they think is achievable. And if it's too extreme one way or the other, they know that they can't pass it. Usually the recency of events like in East Palestine and some of the other derailments that seem to occur shortly thereafter, are those incidences occurring more frequently? Or like many things, are we just paying attention more and they're grabbing headlines more? Right. I'm not here to say one way or the other, but what it does is it puts a lot of attention on it. And so if you want to say striking while the iron is hot, that's what the Secretary is trying to do. When you get into the details and how it works, obviously they feel comfortable enough to say and name drop certain companies and say, hey, look, this is where we're coming after. And there's been a lot of attention from this administration overall on larger corporations and larger businesses, consolidation in industries. Ag in particular has been mentioned even in the past presidential elections about what's happening. So there's a lot of attention on large companies. And so from a regulatory standpoint, it just puts more pressure on businesses like Helena and others to ensure that, look, we're not opposed to safety. Quite frankly, we're doing more than we've ever done from a safety standpoint. But we also have to make sure that when we lay these things out there, they're achievable and going back to the common sense thing, that they make sense in the real world.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The timing is right to probably have these conversations. And you're spot on. There's been, I heard a report this morning, on average, there's about 3 derailments every day. But we always don't hear about them, do we?
Nope.
Only when they're really, really bad. And there, unfortunately, has been a few rough ones here recently.
Well, and with social media and everybody paying attention probably more than they ever have, we see these things more. Said that's not to say that they're not occurring more, but the public's awareness and the desire to know what's going on and to seek information has really reached a fever pitch. And that cuts both ways. You would say that in some ways, the public is more informed than ever before. Sure. At the same time, we're probably more polarized than ever before.
Yep, that's definitely true. And, one of the other areas that the Secretary visited about at our session was talking about infrastructure as it relates to bridges. And clearly, if you're in agriculture, there's waterways everywhere, there's bridges everywhere, and many of these bridges are, frankly, getting old. Let's listen to the Secretary talk a little bit about the Bridges Initiative.
Yeah, so we're certainly sympathetic to the concerns faced by anybody who encounters those load limits. But the load limits are there for safety. And so our view is that the best way to solve that is not to water down the safety regulations, it's to strengthen the roads themselves. And that's why we have unprecedented funding going not only to the examples I shared earlier about, for example, bridges that succeed in a competitive program, but just formula dollars going out to the states for their state transportation improvement plans so that they can do the bread and butter work of making sure the roads are in stronger shape. But yeah, when you have a road or certainly a bridge that has these load limits, that's going to disproportionately affect folks like dairy farmers and so many producers who are depending on the ability to haul those heavy loads.
So clearly, transportation logistics a big key to this audience, obviously, and a big area with the infrastructure plan that was recently passed. A lot of dollars out there.
Absolutely, and Helena's been pretty active in that. Whether that's the efforts at the federal level or initiatives at the local level, where whether it's been letters or being in the capitals and offering vocal support for some of these initiatives to repair our roadways and bridges and waterways, the impact they have on us as a business and our ability to get goods to our customers, the ability of our customers to get goods to the market. And in these rural areas also, we live in these communities. And so it's not just the day-to-day business needs, but we've got kids on school buses.
Right.
And we've got family members traveling these roads, and no one has any desire for them to be less than acceptable.
Correct.
And so Helena has played an active role in that to ensure that we're doing all we can. Yes, everything has a budget, and we've got to be mindful of that, and there's got to be a pay for many of these things. But I would say that as far as Helena goes, food and infrastructure are about as top line as it gets from a priority standpoint.
Sean, last year we were in COVID and coming out of COVID, supply chain was a huge issue for everybody in the world, really, and especially here in agriculture in the United States. Obviously, with the barges coming down the Mississippi, we had challenges there. And we learned, even here in Memphis, when the I-40 bridge had some issues and it was shut down, lots of issues there with supply chain as it relates to trucks. One of the conversations taking place in this area is the reduction of speed. And I had a chance to ask the secretary about the reduction of speed in trucks, and that's a big issue coming out. And here's his response.
Bill Smith, FieldLink podcast. I'm in Memphis. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has promised a speed limit rule for heavy-duty trucks to be reduced. Have we landed on a consensus of what that speed limit will be this year?
I'll have to get back to you on the status of that process, because I know they're going through a process that includes a lot of feedback and a lot of input. And everything FMCSA does is driven by a lot of data and a lot of stakeholder involvement. So I want to make sure I get you the best information, but we'll follow up, AC, and make sure we get that to you.
So obviously, the secretary didn't have a specific answer. Are we going to reduce speed limit by 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour for heavy-duty trucks there? But I think it tells a bigger story. As you mentioned, Sean, earlier, a lot of these initiatives started maybe 1-2 administrations ago, and now the time is right for them to push this initiative through, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, some of these things take a very long time, and I will agree with the secretary there that FMCSA in particular is an agency that relies heavily on data, almost to a fault, as we saw with some of the other programs that they've been working on with crash predictability and the fitness of carriers. They got to that point where I believe they felt comfortable moving forward with this initiative that would reduce the speed of heavy-duty trucks. It has been in the work for years, dating back administrations. The proposals, and I don't remember them off the top of my head. I think they were anywhere from 55 to 60 miles per hour, 64, 66, 68. But the idea being that you would have the technology on board that would limit the speed of those trucks. There are groups on all sides, right. Even within the trucking industry. There are groups that are advocates that believe it's probably for the best. And there are others that believe it's an infringement on their ability to do business, especially in areas where the speed limit itself is significantly higher than that. And, without them going on the record, the comments that if you lower our speed on highways where we're losing ground, it's going to lead to potential for increased speeding in lower speed zones to try and make up that time, because time is money, and moving from ports and moving across country and trying to get in before weather and all sorts of issues is going to cause some additional problems. So their promise, or at least their wish, was to come out with this finalized program by June of 2023. It would not take effect until later, but they have stuck to that timeline. The last I heard, That said, we're in late April now, and I've not heard any indication on a number. And as you asked there at the meeting, the secretary is still not comfortable coming out there and saying, which that doesn't necessarily surprise me.
Right.
If they popped up in June and they said, here it is at 66 miles per hour, it wouldn't shock me. If they also kicked the can down the road a little bit and said, hey, we're still gathering information, because I've been in the room and heard very credible, very well-regarded organizations speak about the pros and cons eloquently. So it wouldn't surprise me if they kicked it down the road and said, we're still not sure exactly where to be. If you go to Europe, in some areas they have a policy where trucks need to be in the right lane, or the slow lane, as we might call it, and they're not supposed to be coming over into the fast lane. That would present its own set of challenges. So it's not a perfect solution. We understand the intent and what they're trying to do for driver safety. Obviously, there's going to be some downsides, so it remains to be seen.
Yep. A lot to happen there in that specific area. And it was a really good session with the secretary. He was very transparent, very well spoken throughout our session there. And then we had the opportunity to visit with Robert Bonney. He is the Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation in the Risk Management Agency. And he had some really interesting things to talk about. And here's Robert Bonney talking a little bit about conservation and volunteerism.
What we're essentially asking folks to do is voluntarily adopt conservation practices. Regulatory approaches aren't very good at getting people to, you're not going to adapt soil health practices at the end of a gun barrel. And so the approach here, we think the voluntary approach is absolutely the right one. But we need the data to be able to prove this, to demonstrate that it's that this approach can work. So we're making big investments, both with resources in the Inflation Reduction Act and outside, to make sure that we can prove this up. That we have better numbers on soil carbon, that we have better numbers on methane, better numbers on nitrous oxide emissions. And we think if we can do that, right now if you think back a decade or more ago, everybody assumed it was going to be cap and trade. That's how we were going to do climate change. We're all trying to figure out what the rules are. The playing field is way more open right now. And we have an opportunity here to work in partnership with agriculture and forestry to develop things that will work for the climate and work for producers. Data is going to be critical, both to provide the information that producers need, but also to be able to look the public in the eye and look Congress in the eye and say, hey, these resources are providing real results.
Yeah, I think that was a really good comment, especially at the end there from Robert Bonney, who has been with the agency for quite some time, several different presidencies and so forth. But talking about the importance of data, that's critical to all of these policies.
Yeah, I think that that's the tricky thing with USDA is they're so reliant on accurate data. And on our side of things, and especially our grower customers, the pressure is to make sure that you submit accurate data. And I can understand why sometimes there's concern about where that data goes and how it's being used or misused. But as you heard from Dr. Bonney, and I think you heard from Hubert over at the at NASS,
Yep.
The importance is if you don't submit accurate data when it comes down to crop insurance or any other programs that are being put on by USDA, if the data we submit is not accurate, then payments and other assumptions by the agency are going to be inaccurate. And so there's a lot of reliance on data. Dr. Bonney's been there for a long time and advised the Obama administration and now the Biden administration. The emphasis on voluntary conservation practices is critical to the ag industry, and USDA and other agencies are a bit shorthanded. And so, to ensure that we're doing all we can, we have to rely on some of these conservation practices being done voluntarily and work in conjunction, public-private partnerships to ensure that funding is there to incentivize these folks, but mandating and regulating is not necessarily the answer. And there's some other opportunities moving forward. I think one of the things that we've looked at here recently with the upcoming Farm Bill is, can we take some of our CCAs, Helena and a number of our fellow retailers and distributors and other agronomists out there have their certified crop advisor certifications and other certifications. but they are not qualified by default as technical service providers within USDA's programs. And those folks that are writing nutrient management plans for growers to ensure that they're doing everything from a fertility and manure standpoint, they're down to, I think, just a little over 1,000 folks across the country. So there is an initiative that we've discussed about, hey, the CCA exam, it might trump the SAT, ACT, LSAT.
Right.
I mean,
it's a tough one, right?
For folks who have taken the CCA exam, they'll tell you that might be the hardest exam they've ever taken. Is there a way that we might be able to get CCAs to either automatically or maybe by just application process qualify as a technical service provider within USDA and fund that program to ensure that those folks are also available to write these nutrient management plans, so that we have more access, so that our growers have more access to folks who are able to write these plans. And it's not just those that have access to their NRCS folks or people that can afford to pay the premium to go out there and find somebody. So there's an efficiency to be gained there.
Right.
But again, that's reliant on the USDA working with individuals and business.
Well, I think you bring up a great point, because we at Helena have put a huge investment into that CCA certification for many of our people, and in addition to that, our investment in agri-intelligence, to capturing this data, to managing that data, we've got a pretty good platform in front of us to help support some of these conservation initiatives.
And that's where you see the government takes advantage of those private opportunities. All the way up to Homeland Security.
Correct.
And you find out when, and we've got a debt ceiling crisis now, but when you get into these sequestrations and you find out who's not being paid and who is being paid, because you find out, well, what's being outsourced and where is the government utilizing non-governmental employees to be as efficient as possible, and we're no different.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, a great opportunity really to do the right thing. Our investments that Helen has made over 20 some years ago into the data and of course into our people could certainly pay off exponentially over the next several years.
Absolutely.
Okay, Sean, let's move on. Senator out of Arkansas, Republican, Senate Agriculture Committee Ranking Member Boozman, he had some things to talk a little bit about around the Farm Bill, as well as being a safety net.
What we're doing is running around the country. I've been to several states already. I've got 16 or 17 on the books in the next couple months. Again, listening to producers, trying to figure out what they want. And I'll tell you what I hear at the top of the list as I go around and visit with farmers, and that's all about making sure that the safety nets are in place, making sure that the risk management tools that they need are there. We're in an interesting time right now. We have a generational high inflation. We've got generational high interest rates. So there's a lot of angst out in the farm community, as you all know, and they're going to need those risk management tools so that they have the comfort in themselves that they can go forward, but also they're going to need them with the shakiness of the banking institutions right now and the increased regulation. They're going to need those risk management tools as they go to their bankers and get the loans that they need going forward. It's not only a safety net for farmers, but it's a safety net for rural America.
So certainly the senator talking about, the Farm Bill being a safety net, a security place. Certainly we have a lot of financial challenges in the country and around the world, but the Farm Bill certainly being a safety net for many producers.
Yeah. When you look at the way crop insurance is perceived outside of the ag industry, sometimes it falls under that, that's farmer subsidies.
Right.
And, farm subsidies, and I think that's a bit of a misnomer because really that's allowing them the financial freedom to operate. And I think we've discussed before that farmer income is a net loser without off-farm income.
Right.
Most of these farmers, that's a tough to balance the years, the good years and the bad years. Crop insurance is what allows them to stay sustainable in the truest sense, and that is to keep the farm operating and profitable. From a national security standpoint, that's paramount. Right. And so crop insurance has, the percentage of the Farm Bill has deteriorated. Mm-hmm. The largest chunk of that, over 80% of that is going to be supplemental nutrition. And I mentioned earlier the debt ceiling, and that's kind of the elephant in the room right now.
Right.
As I meet with members of Congress, and we want to discuss priorities for the Farm Bill, but it's hard to understand just what your I guess your parameters and your limits will be for the Farm Bill discussion, because we don't understand from a funding standpoint how much of a haircut we're going to take.
Right.
The debt ceiling, by most accounts, we have enough money to pay our bills through early June. Originally, we thought we'd get a little bit further than that. I think tax receipts were lower than anticipated. And so if we don't figure that out, or depending on what the solution is, and leadership is working on that, but we can't truly have an honest discussion about what the Farm Bill is really going to look like until we get through the debt ceiling. But and this isn't a crystal ball, ag is going to be on the defensive. We do not anticipate any growth of that funding. It's really just defense. It's really just don't cut any more. And crop insurance is going to be top of the list for us as an ag industry, and for Helena, and the importance it is on securing the long-term health of our customers. So no matter what state you're in, and Senator Bozeman mentioned that, I was at his first hearing that he had at Arkansas State in Jonesboro, and they went up to Michigan State and met with the chair, Senator Stabenow's home state up there, and they're hearing it from everybody. The crop may change a little bit, the accent may change a little bit, but the priority is still the same from a national security standpoint, to keep family farms operating and to keep food production in this country. Crop insurance, the conversation starts there.
Sean, one of the neat things that I picked up, and you're in the mix every day. This is what you do, but I don't. But one of the neat things that I experienced this week was to watch both, senators and congresspeople, men, women, whatever it may be, on either side of the aisle, be pretty consistent as it relates to agriculture and I don't want to just say their talking points, but I think the spirit's all driven right for the most part.
Ag is a special committee and a special industry. I'm not going to sit here and say that they always agree on everything.
Sure.
But if you're looking for a committee, House and Senate, where both sides of the aisle are willing to come to the middle, ag is where it's at. I think that most people on that committee understand that food and clothing are not a red or a blue RD, urban, rural. It doesn't matter.
Right.
We all eat. We all need clothes. We all want to protect the future of ourselves and our children and our children's children. And so that committee it's a great committee. Most of the folks on those committees are great to work with. You do see it, and I think somebody else said this in a prior meeting I had, that they were shocked that members from different parties got along so well.
Right.
And we're more split and more divided. We have fewer moderates than ever before, but there's still a lot of agreement on some core principles up there, and there are still some friendships up there. And ag is one of the ones where you can still see it out in the open, as opposed to some of the other ones where it's a bit more extreme.
Well, I completely agree with you. I had the opportunity to see Senator Deputy Stanbo out of Michigan, and Congressman Glenn Thompson, GT, who is he is the House Ag Committee chair. So you got the Senate chair, you got the House chair. They were like high-fiving each other. I mean, they were like brother and sister, just very conversational and open and hugging, and you don't always see that on the general media. And it was very pleasing as a taxpayer, as a citizen, to see, folks that they don't see eye to eye on everything, but they stacked hands on a lot of the important stuff.
No, and if you take, the former chair on the House Ag side, now ranking member Scott from Georgia. Georgia's a great ag state. They know that ag is important. Chairman Thompson from Pennsylvania. This is his first go-around as chair of the Ag Committee, and a lot of pressure to write a farm bill, especially with the financial situation as it is.
Right.
Senator Bozeman has been through this process. He was not chair last farm bill. That was Senator Roberts from Kansas. But a long time proponent of ag, and from a great ag state in Arkansas. And then Chairwoman Stabenow, and she is retiring, so she is leaving. And as opposed to some people thinking, okay, well, you're 1 foot out the door, you're not as engaged. Quite the opposite. Most of these folks feel like this is a lasting legacy, and they want to ensure that it is done before they leave office and done the right way because their name's written all over it. So all 4 of those folks have a pretty good relationship with each other because they are all working toward a common goal. And the benefit of having supplemental nutrition and the farm and ag programs tied together is we know we're going to get bipartisan support.
Right.
There have always been folks that have said, well, what if we split them out? And then we can get more of our priorities tucked into it. Most groups understand that keeping them tied together is what allows that cohesiveness and that bipartisanship.
Well, and to your point, if you pull nutrition out of the Farm Bill, you just lost a lot of urban senators that could really care less for, probably 80-90% of what we're even talking about today.
And I mean, on the rural side of things, the same thing. And Chairman Thompson will tell you, as a young adult, he was a recipient of supplemental nutrition. And everyone, urban or rural, probably knows somebody who knows somebody who is or was a recipient. And so, there's going to be disagreements over work requirements for nutrition. There's going to be disagreements over the use of pesticides and subsidizing farmers. There's going to be these disagreements, but the overall goal is the same, and that is to make sure that people do not go hungry and that we have food in this country.
Yeah, that's a good goal for all of us, obviously. Kind of carrying on that journey here, Congressman Abigail Spanberger from Virginia. She's a Democrat, and I believe this is her first term.
First Farm Bill.
First Farm Bill. Okay, first Farm. I don't know her that well. Had the opportunity to chat with her and listen to her a little bit. Neat person, excellent background. CIA.
Oh yeah.
This person, she's a deep thinker, and I'll never forget what she said. She was very conversational about it, but she's like, I like to approach these bills like I did when I was with the CIA. It's about the facts. And boy, I'll tell you, she perked a lot of ears up. And so let's listen to the Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger from Virginia.
On the line of the people that you'll be hearing from, there's a couple of us who are on the Agriculture Committee and also on the House Intelligence Committee. And so are focused together on issues related to protecting, supporting, being partners with American ag, and then also recognizing some heightened national security risks that may exist when we see control of American farmland going to foreign owners. There's a couple elements to that. There's the actual, are there swaths of American farmland that are being purchased that might be in geographically interesting or sensitive places, right? Like that's one bucket, near military installations, near sensitive government-related properties where a foreign government comes in and buys that land. That's one element of an area of concern. The other area of an element of concern is what happens when, bit by bit or acre by acre, farm by farm, outside foreign entities are purchasing the land that we need to feed our country, or the land that we need to kind of be an integral part of our communities and drivers of rural economy. And those are at times two separate discussions. The conversations that are ongoing, and we, as you mentioned, have introduced legislation to this point. I think the conversations are happening at a steady pace, which I think is important because we certainly don't want to just say, all foreign purchase of American land is bad, right? Like painting that with a broad brush can be problematic. But certainly looking at the two different elements of the challenge we're facing, certainly farmland near sensitive government installations, that's something that requires a bit more urgency in how we address it. But then overall looking at the strategy of, what are ways that, a producer who might be looking to sell their farm, and the buyer, their economic interests are to sell to the person who wants to buy for the best price. Well, what else exists as an option if that producer does want to sell to the next generation farmer, down the street who just can't put up that level of capital? Like, is it a capital investment issue? Is it this is what this the landowner who's selling is faced with and the decision they're making. So this gets into kind of larger scale discussions of not just are there national security implications, yes or no, or it's very nuanced, but then also if our goal is to say it's optimal when an American farmer continues farming American land, are there things that we could be doing to help first generation or new farmers be able to make the investments in that land that otherwise the capital might only exist with insert whatever foreign-owned entity.
So clearly, the Congresswoman really, she really understands security, national security. She's probably one of the top thought leaders on the committee, I would assume, that has that kind of background to really understand that.
Yeah, no, extremely impressive and also intimidating. For anybody that ever watched, if you ever watched Homeland and you got Carrie Mathison, somebody that's just 3 steps ahead of you, that makes you second guess yourself. That's her, and she's been a strong proponent of ag. Yes, there have been initiatives coming from the Democratic side of the aisle that sometimes many ag groups are concerned with, but she's looked out for our interests, and even going back to last Congress, she was listed on a letter that went into the EPA that said, "Hey, slow down on all these pesticide restrictions and bans because we're losing tools. There's court decisions. There's trade issues, and farmers need tools, and we need to trust the science and not make emotional or political decisions." And so, a good advocate for ag. You can tell by what she went over, not only from a national security standpoint, but from just an overall trade standpoint, the impact of some of this foreign ag ownership, and it is probably the most widespread issue that we're seeing across this country right now. Okay. So there are bills being tossed about in D.C., and there are bills in dozens of states across the country, and they all have different flavors, ultimately trying to get at the same common issue, which is other countries owning land,
right?
Sometimes even just leasing land, but owning land in the United States. And while many of them have started to narrow down their focus to whatever they will call them, adversarial countries or hostile countries,
sure.
Russia, China, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, some of them are a little bit more broad. And we understand the intent is to protect national security. Like she said, if there's a facility going up that's just happens to be next to a site of national security concerns, we understand. And if there's countries that are purchasing ag land, using our resources, growing that food, and then shipping that food back to their country, and they're just using our property to harvest that food, we understand that. But there's also a lot of individuals and a lot of companies and a lot of trade partners internationally that we have agreements with. And there's a lot of farmers and groups that invest and own land in other countries.
That's right.
And that's where we've got to be very cautious. Thinking back to your education and learning about physics, that there's for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. We've got to be very cautious with the approach we take in this protectionist type environment. And I find it somewhat interesting because we've seen this really large effort, and it's not just Republican or Democrat. If you look at the state bill being initiated in California, it's a Democratic lead. She mentioned her concerns over it. At the same time, when we were experiencing all these supply chain struggles, there was actually conversations about repealing the Jones Act. The Jones Act goes back 100 years, and it's an anti-espionage measure that was taken to prevent foreign adversarial countries from operating ships in American waters. So today, a foreign flagged ship cannot sail from a U.S. port to a U.S. port. They can leave or they can come, but they can't go port to port. Well, when we couldn't get barges and we were struggling to get things moved, there were discussions about, hey, do we need to repeal the Jones Act and allow some of our partners who are from other countries to go port to port so that we can get our goods to where they need to go?
From A to B, yeah.
So we're having that conversation, and yet at the same time, we're having conversations about restricting investment and ownership of land. It tells you how quickly that conversation can shift.
Right.
But it is a concern. There are bills that will pass, whether that's in Texas, in Florida. There are states where these types of bills will pass. I don't know that it will pass at the federal level, but you can tell the appetite is there. There's a lot of concern. The giant balloon flying over the country did not help the issue.
Right.
So we'll see where it goes, but it no different than some of the previous things we've talked about. It all comes back to national security and food security and COVID and some of the trade stuff and the crisis in Ukraine with Russia. All of these things have added up to get us to where we are today.
Well, definitely a great interview with the Congresswoman from Virginia. And, you know, the one thing that we didn't talk about, unique thing, her situation, her district really is just outside of D.C.
Yep.
So, you know, half of her constituents are very much urban, and then head over a pass and boom, very rural as well.
She is one of those ones that you watch every election. You know, members of the House are running every 2 years. Actually, they're running as soon as they get elected.
Exactly.
As soon as they get
You'll never
elected,
stop.
they're picking the phone up and they're asking for contributions and they're running again. But she is one of those districts that you watch because it's a very close district. The makeup has urban or suburban constituents, but also rural constituents. And so that's why she knows that she's got to look out for the interests of a very large spectrum of individuals versus just a rural district or just an urban district.
Right. Yeah, interesting. Hey, then we're going to move further west. We've got Senator Roger Marshall from Kansas. He's a Republican, certainly a strong voice for agriculture. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about methane gases and some of the challenges that they're seeing and some of the solutions in Kansas.
So let's just talk about methane just for a second. So a third of methane production comes from wetlands. So I'm surrounded by Cheyenne Bottoms and Quivira Refuge. Love them, need to protect them, all those things. A third of it comes from the oil and gas industry. Look, we need to embrace that, and I think innovation can and will solve that challenge. 20% of methane comes from city dumps. How much does ag contribute to? If you would listen to the national media and to the climate demagogues, agriculture must be responsible for, what do you think, 90% of methane? We're responsible for 10%. 10%. And let's work on it. All across the state, I see operations taking their waste and catching that methane gas. City of Dodge doing the same thing with their water system. We need urban centers helping us. There should not be a drop of water leaves Kansas that's not used again. All of the waste should be treated, capturing that methane gas as well. Let's do it. How can we impact that city dump as well? We need urban America involved with this rather than just pointing the finger at agriculture. Trust me, my kids' inheritance will be land, not a lot of money.
Okay, so clearly the senator's pretty passionate about methane.
Senator Marshall is one of those that from the moment he stepped into office, and I think back to his first term in the U.S. House of Representatives, he came out to our facility in Garden City, Kansas, and was fully engaged. And not that when they come out to our locations, they're not, but some of them, it's a little bit more of, I'm coming out, I'm doing a site visit, I'm touring with people, I'm being seen. He was one of those individuals that really came out and wanted to learn. And we brought out our maps, our agri-intelligence maps, and showed him what we were doing from a precision ag standpoint. And he really got on the fast track. As I mentioned, the senator that headed up the ag committee last farm bill was Pat Roberts from Kansas.
Right.
And the senator retired. And Senator Marshall, stepped into that seat. So he went from being in the private sector, I believe he's a vet by trade,
doctor,
to the House, to the Senate, and continues to be outspoken in his advocacy for agriculture. So somebody that we know stands behind us and is going to be educated, is not just going to throw things out there. At the same time, one of those that we've got to make sure that we stay engaged with, because when you have somebody who becomes the figurehead, the one that everybody's listening to hear what they say, kind of like we talked about representing constituents, he's talking about the energy and gas sector. He's talking about the livestock sector. He's talking about the pesticide sector. He's talking about all of those. And while we are all in unison 90 to 95% of the time, there are going to be those differences. So happy to have him there and what he's doing and his staff, because we need those advocates up there.
Yep. Need that strong voice. He continues on talking about kind of an important topic. I call this kind of the tug of war internally that maybe us as citizens don't always hear about. But let's listen to the Senator Marshall from Kansas talk about the USDA versus the EPA.
Right. So there's 3 carbon sinks out there, right? 3 big carbon sinks, the ocean, trees, and soil. So if you want me to continue to do no-till farm on our ranch, then we need these chemicals to do that. And I just don't think that many people at the EPA understand that sometimes you have to trade one for another and see which is the maximum benefit. So that's what we need to be sharing, is that part of the story. One of my big frustrations up here is that the USDA scientists are not getting the respect that they deserve, that the EPA is not listening to them, is not listening to our Secretary of Agriculture who's fighting for us. So we need a loud voice in the Secretary of Agriculture Department explaining to the EPA exactly what you're talking about. I don't think I'd expect a farmer to argue with the EPA, but we expect the USDA, though, to be arguing with this administration, saying, slow down, be careful what you're wishing for here, or we'll be plowing up all this soil sink that we've been having carbon set in the Marshall Farm for 20 years.
Great point. Kind of some insider look and views there, Sean. What's your perspective?
Well, I think if and I'm not sure how many people stopped midweek to watch this, but another event in DC this week was the House Ag Committee hearing with EPA Administrator Michael Regan.
Right.
And not that a lot was said from the administrator's part. He knew this was coming. The members of the House Ag Committee, particularly the Republican members, had been waiting for this opportunity to share their gripes and their frustrations with the EPA, and that was one of the things that came up in the hearing was, hey, EPA, why don't you listen to USDA? Why is it that USDA has all this experience and all this work, being out in the field, working with folks, looking at what's happening out there, and yet when they present science or scientific arguments to you and other things, you tend to disregard them. I'm not going to say that happens all the time or that that's the rule. Does it occur where agencies don't see eye to eye or don't talk? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And you can see that that's where a frustration lies. And you can hear the passion in his voice. And it's shared by some of his counterparts on the House and Senate side that, why aren't these agencies working together more often? We can even see that now with where we are with EPA on endangered species. They now know that they have to work more closely with the Fish and Wildlife and the services folks to ensure that they're doing their consultations on the front end that historically they weren't doing. And so while they're all in DC and their leaders are all appointed by the president, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always talking to each other and that all their varying arms and departments within talk to each other. So it's a very real concern. We say that we believe in the science, that we want to trust the science and follow the science. And when we meet with folks from USDA, not that we always agree with everything that comes out, but we feel like that's the best agency up there that's at least trying to advocate for ag. And so when there is this belief, rightly or wrongly, that information is being disregarded, you're going to have a gripe. EPA has a tough job.
Yeah.
They are trying to, they believe, and most of the officials at the EPA believe that pesticides play a critical role in food and vegetation management and food production. They also understand that pesticides by nature kill things. And so it's a tricky job to balance how you regulate a material that has such a benefit, but also, if used improperly, such a risk. So it's not an easy job for EPA. We get it, but that does not mean that we don't hold you accountable, and I think that's what you saw there.
Yeah, definitely, and a good call out and a good, piece of information, again, for voters to really understand what's going on there. And it's not always the politicians involved. I mean, these are two agencies that, and we heard earlier in the week that they're struggling too, just in head counts. They've got, budgets to manage and people. They're having a heck of a time hiring people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you go back and I believe the last time that we were on, we were talking about PREA, the Pesticide Registration Improvement Act, and our ability to raise the funding for the Office of Pesticide Programs, and that will allow them to hire, I think at the last count, they were maybe looking at hiring 40 new employees in the Office of Pesticide Programs, which would allow us to get pesticides re-registered and reviewed, and also new ones approved. The challenge is they are still way below where they need to be from a staffing standpoint. 10 years ago, if they had 1,000, today they're under 600.
Right.
So there's nobody there to do that job. And that presents its own set of challenges if there's not an individual there, and the individuals that are there are new hires that, quite frankly, industry is having to train because we have the experience. So they've got their work cut out for them. I said, we're not always going to like what the EPA does, but we also recognize that they are the body that we give the authority to for review of pesticides.
Right.
And if we're going to have them there, they need to be staffed to a certain extent. I go back to the debt ceiling conversation. That's the big concern we have, right? So, we got funding through in this past year, but moving forward, if things have to take a haircut, that's one of the ones that will take a haircut. And so do we end up going right back to where we were? So we're doing more endangered species revisions. We've got more lawsuits occurring that are putting more pressure on the EPA, and yet the staffing's just not there. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that's going to slow things down. And when it comes to Helena's ability to provide the best agronomic tools out there and that fit our economic principles, that's an issue.
Yeah, definitely a challenge there in that area. Sean, we're keep chugging along here. We had the opportunity also to listen to a new congresswoman from the state of Florida. She's a Republican, Catherine Kammack. She is also on the House Committee for Agriculture as well as the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. And really interesting, kind of caught all of us off a little bit here, Sean. She brought up a point. She's getting ready to put together a bill and can possibly propose it here next week on critical minerals. Let's take a listen to the senator, or congressman rather.
For our producers, I am looking at the critical inputs like fertilizers. Next week, I'll be dropping a bill that will list phosphate and potash as critical minerals, which to date, they are not listed as such. When you look at facilities like Nutrien, which phosphate is in everything from our Diet Cokes to our cosmetics to, of course, animal feed, and it's a critical input for producers, you see that it's a little bit of a disconnect that it's not a critical mineral. So we're excited for that legislation that will not only streamline some of the permitting hurdles that our folks face in mining, but it'll also end up driving down the cost for consumers at the end of the day, because by extension, our producers who utilize it will not have to pay as much.
Definitely a very energetic new congresswoman from Florida, tackling a pretty tough topic there.
Yeah, and this is one that was actually pursued last Congress as well, really kind of a result of all the issues that we've seen. Again, COVID, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, high tariffs and trade issues. This is a bill that, and she mentioned it, she's from Florida, and Florida has a strong fertilizer presence in the domestic market. And being aware of the impact that it's having of relying, no different than energy, on other countries, and sometimes countries that are viewed as adversarial. And so there's a big push to support domestic production, to make sure that we have access and we are not reliant on those trade partners. Not that we necessarily want to get away from having foreign partners in the trade of fertilizer, but we've got reserves and we've got a fair amount of macronutrients within the U.S. borders that the permitting process is lengthy and there's a lot of red tape in it. And so what this is going to do is, if we designate them as critical minerals, this would streamline that. And so another effort that probably wouldn't get passed as a standalone, but might be added into a farm bill.
Right.
And so I think, going back to Senator Marshall and some others, these are the types of things that kind of markers. Hey, this is a priority for us. We've talked about this before. Is the time right with the Farm Bill coming up, that this is something that all sides can understand, especially given where we've been over the last 3 to 4 years, that will help the American farmer and rancher ensure that they have the materials that they need when things go sideways.
Right. And I think that's a great point. And it goes really, in this case, beyond agriculture, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
So it certainly impacts all consumers across the world. Sean, had the great opportunity to listen to, as we talked about earlier, the senator from Michigan, Debbie Stabenow. She's Democrat, also the Senate Ag Committee chair. She talked about some of the importance as it relates to ad hoc funding for the crop insurance program. Let's take a listen to the senator.
In the rest, in terms of commodities, crop insurance, other areas, it's pretty much flat funding. And the challenge for us has been, because of the trade challenges, because of COVID, because of a number of things the last few years, we've put almost $90 billion in ad hoc funding through appropriations into supporting agriculture. And we also have there's been, in the last year, to cover 2022 levels, we have about $18 billion in crop insurance indemnities for 2022. And so we want, in my mind, we need to make sure we strengthen crop insurance. We've got to address making sure, even though prices are up now, prices are good, input costs are up, so we have to deal with all of that. But how do we support those commodities that need us to be able to do something different? It's not true for all of them.
So there you have it from the senator of Michigan, talking a little bit about some of that ad hoc funding.
Yeah, and this is her, I hesitate to say legacy, but the chairwoman is retiring. She will not seek re-election. And so this is going to be it for her. She has every intention of passing this farm bill and making sure that it looks how she wants it to, with Democrats retaining the majority in the Senate. She is the last stop. She's the leader when it comes to the Senate version. And the Senate tends to be a bit of the cooler, right? You need a larger group of bipartisanship to get something passed in the Senate. And so she's really going to be the key piece in this. And so meeting with her office, no matter what you're talking about, really is the starting point. And an experienced woman that has been through these things before, but will get her chance to put her fingerprints on this one. And so I think she comes at it from a right place. She's saying all the right things. Moving forward, the timing of it, it's due, the Farm Bill expires September 30th. They are, from a leadership standpoint, they are sticking to that date. That date will get here quicker than when we realize, with the August recess and the debt ceiling really not resolved until possibly even June. I don't think a lot of folks are optimistic. I think they're probably more realistic that it might get extended. But when it comes to leadership, they're going to tell you they're going to get it done on time because they want to stick to that. Right. And you're not going to hear a whole lot of polarizing conversation coming out of someone like the chairwoman or Senator Bozeman. The leadership knows that they need to be kind of the base right there and try and toe the line versus some of the Ag Committee members that might have certain priorities they want to see involved. So certainly saying all the right things. We'll see where we are.
Well, and to tee that right up, Congressman Glenn G.T. Thompson kind of ties it up. He's a Republican out of Pennsylvania. I believe he's also a dairy farmer, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, now he came up through the medical industry. Okay. I want to say, but grew up in the farm arena, and was truly excited. This was a goal of his. To get the chairman role of the House Ag Committee was something that he had worked on, and I'll say this, and it's not throwing shade at Ag. There are a lot of individuals that want nothing to do with the Ag Committee, and they might get placed on it so that they have a committee. But there are those individuals, and generally they're going to be folks that grew up on a farm, maybe even still farm, that ask for the Ag Committee. And Chairman Thompson's one of those that he wanted the Ag Committee. Had a chance to be with him. He was up. We were up in his home state at an outing, and one of our branch managers and I met with him, and you could hear the passion that he had. And he comes at it from a very good place. Even within we were talking about the Farm Bill and the supplemental nutrition piece, that's something that he was a recipient. He has no intention of making extreme, very polarized decisions on things like supplemental nutrition. So a great person to have in that role.
Well, definitely the congressman's also on the House Committee on Education and Workforce, very critical to everything that we do here at Helena and really across the whole nation. So listen to G.T. Thompson as he kind of, I guess, wraps things up for us.
The one thing that probably is our biggest challenge is the clock. The fact that this current Farm Bill expires the end of September, but I am an eternal optimist and leaning in on getting this done. We have an obligation to those hardworking families that provide us food, fiber, building materials, and energy resources, and quite frankly, all families across the country that rely on us to have access to the nutrition, have the economic impact that rural America provides, the jobs, the just tremendous contributions we have to a better environment and a cleaner climate, because those are all things that happen.
And there you have it from G.T. Thompson out of Pennsylvania, the congressman, really kind of pointing out the clock is ticking.
Absolutely. It's said that the days will go by, and they will go by quickly. And we were talking a bit offline beforehand that one of the challenges we have is if we can get a farm bill approved in this year, that would be, while optimistic, it would be great. It will be tough to get many of your priorities outlined until we know kind of financially where the country is and what spending is going to look like. The more likely scenario is an extension and kicking it down the road, as they say with all these measures, into a later date in 2023 or into 2024. Moving things into 2024 would allow us more time to work out the fine details, to have some more lengthy conversations about initiatives that all sides want to see included in this farm bill, especially things that maybe we tried to get in the last farm bill that people liked, but maybe there wasn't enough support or wasn't enough information.
Right.
And we feel like 5 years later, okay, we're there. So it would allow more time for that. The challenge is 2024 is a presidential election year.
Right.
And when you start having or forcing elected members to take stances on issues in an election year, we talked about Representative Spanberger, when you get into a close district or a close Senate race, people get very sensitive to having to take stances. And so pushing it into an election year brings in a completely different challenge, which is some of your ideas may get the boot. Even though you have more time to think them out, they may get the boot because controversial is probably a little bit of an aggressive term, but they're not as unanimously agreed upon. And so if you put somebody on the spot to take a stance on that, they may say, hey, look, this will stop the farm bill from moving. I don't want to take a stance on this. Kick it out.
Right.
So it's kind of a contradiction, because if you want to get things in, you almost need to rush it, which is never a good thing. So I said, I think that outside of the staff of the ag committees and the leaders themselves, I think most people think some sort of extension will occur. But we've been proven wrong before. We didn't believe that the Pesticide Registration Improvement Act had any chance of being passed last Congress, and the week of Christmas, there it was. So
right.
I guess I'll reserve and say, hey, why not?
Well, Sean, as we mentioned earlier in this episode, we talked about EPA Regan being up on Hill this week. He had to do some testifying. One of the things that was certainly talked about, and that's impacting agriculture as well as really all of us, is WOTUS. What are your thoughts around WOTUS, and wow, what are we going to be looking at here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the waters of the United States, death, taxes, and WOTUS. The waters of the United States changes, whether that was under the Obama administration and the changes that they enacted, and then the Trump administration came along and stripped that down and put their own spin on it. And the new administration came in, the Biden administration came in, and Administrator Regan said, this will be some sort of compromise between the two, and more or less it kind of goes back to the pre-Obama rule. We've got a decision by the EPA that came out a little while ago that said, okay, this is how we're going to define what a water of the United States is, and what would be subject to federal permitting, and the impact that has on farms and ranches, on home builders, on everybody.
On and on, yeah.
But at the same time, you've got, I think, 26 states now. I think there was a decision out of South Dakota that I think put an injunction there and stopped it in 24 states. I think Texas and Idaho, I think, had their own separate ones. So you got 26 states right now that are operating under one rule, 24 states that are operating under a different rule. EPA feels like they kind of did what they wanted to do with their definition. And you've got a Supreme Court case going on right now with a family out in Idaho that, depending on how that comes down, could turn the thing on its head. So the uncertainty has not gone away, which is what everybody has said is the issue. Which is this, is this a waterway? Is an area that actually flows but isn't near anything else not a waterway, but is a puddle that doesn't flow, but it happens to be 50 yards away from another waterway,
right?
That does qualify. And what does that mean? So for businesses and for people, yeah, I mean, it is. And I know there are groups out there, especially the American Farm Bureau, that are advocating daily, trying to ensure that they do all they can. But those types of decisions by the EPA are why the Ag Committee was so eager to get Administrator Regan up there, whether it was WOTUS, whether it was the cancellation of pesticides such as chlorpyrifos, whether it was some of the other federal programs that EPA is pursuing on some of the climate stuff. It's not to say that those decisions may not necessarily be right, but they've got to understand that they're going to be held accountable for those decisions. And there are a lot of people that don't exist in some of the big cities,
right,
that see things differently. And when parties flip and one becomes the majority, your comeuppance, they're there, and he knew it was coming, and you can tell. I mean, the administrator didn't really say anything. He said a whole lot of nothing while he was being interviewed, and I completely get it. He knew it was coming. He probably had his game plan in place, so he did what he needed to do. And for the lawmakers that were there, especially the Republican lawmakers are there, they got their constituents' gripes out and made sure that the voices were heard.
Which is how it works. That's how it's supposed to work, right?
Oh yeah. And I think I think the show, when you look at the Senate hearings and stuff like that, where they have their one-on-one meetings and backdoor meetings, and then they go to the show,
right,
and they ask the question, you hear the answer. Well, as we discussed in our previous meeting, and so you understand that, look, these conversations have already been had.
It's taken place.
But we want to make sure that the crowd now gets to see it. And that's a bit of the show of politics.
Yeah, definitely. Well, definitely a lot of questions around WOTUS. Still a lot of details to come out there. Like all of these bills and all of these rules, the devil's in the details. Just to kind of close up, Sean, PFAS, another hot topic this round. Anything new there?
I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't talk about PFAS, the four-letter word that just keeps on going. EPA came out with their drinking water standard. There are still questions about where we need to be from a definition. There are thousands of these materials. Very little is known about the vast majority of them. There are about a half dozen that have been determined to cause some sort of ill effects, and where they are, we're finding them everywhere. We're finding them in farmland. I think you saw some instances where they found them in dairy farms up in Maine, and the legislators up there have tried to take action and looked into it. We've seen them in packaging, and not just ag, but anything.
Sure.
But at the same time, we also got to be very cautious. There was a study that came out that from Texas Tech that found them in pesticides, and it caused a lot of alarm. Mm-hmm. And people went, okay, well, how did it get in there? Did it come from the pesticide itself, the active ingredient? Did it come out from the inert? Did it come from the packaging that it was in? Nobody could point their finger. And so you see everybody, some people saying, well, it's the inerts. We need to know more about the inerts. Some people saying, well, we need to look at the active ingredient. It's definitely there. Others saying, well, it's coming from fluorinated containers. So everybody went back to their own shops and starts digging around. Well, what could it possibly be coming from? The interesting thing with that specific study is EPA pulled those samples into their own lab. And they mentioned it in a meeting we had with them, and they said, we've actually had to change out our hosing and a lot of our equipment that we're testing. We're doing state-of-the-art PFAS testing, but we've had to move and change out pieces to ensure that the equipment doesn't have PFAS in it.
So it doesn't contaminate the results.
Exactly. And so the interesting thing you find is they tested the samples, the same samples that came out of that study, and they didn't find PFAS in it.
Okay.
So many more questions than answers. There are states that are moving rapidly ahead, some faster than others. Administrator Regan being from North Carolina, which has had its own set of issues with PFAS. We are moving rapidly. It's a very concerning issue. We get, but we also have to make sure that we make the right decisions and not get too far ahead of ourselves. Do the science, do the work, but not scare everybody to the extent that these materials are something that may be different than everything else we've ever really looked at from a cleanup standpoint. These things are in everything, and some of the things that they're in, they may be irreplaceable, and they may be critical to human health or technology or what we use. And so I think most folks realize that, but it is a daily conversation piece that does not just touch ag, it touches everybody, but certainly ag needs to be aware of it and make sure that we're looking out for how it has an impact on us.
And like you mentioned, education's the key here. We really need to dig in and better understand that, not just in agriculture, but really as a human race.
Oh, yeah.
Sean, finally, again, lots of things taking place in D.C. right now, but it all comes down to the almighty dollar. The debt policy, the ceiling there, how is spending going to impact everything we've talked about on this episode?
Yeah, it's been a while since that ceiling was established and raised at whatever it is, 31.4 trillion or whatever the number is. And we blew past it in January. We kind of knew.
Right.
I said earlier we thought we might get to late summer before we were unable to pay our bills. Now it looks like it's June. And so I think maybe not in a public sphere. Most lawmakers would tell you that, it's going to get raised, that we need to pay our obligations. But that doesn't mean that we need to do it irresponsibly. And so it will have an impact because there are certain things that are going to get funded. The military, defense, that there are things that are non-negotiable. But what that means is other things are going to have to take a cut. And I'm always somewhat tickled because you hear these people on TV talk about special interest groups.
Right.
And I think, well, everybody up there is talking about something that's of interest to them. Everybody's a special interest group.
Yep.
Everybody cares about something that's a priority to them. And so it's not easy to do because when you tell somebody that we're going to cut this and it's your number one or number two priority, that doesn't feel good. But those things are going to happen. It's just a matter of how big a cut that's going to be. So I think we know that the ceiling will get raised. Yes, there's some extreme folks out there that disagree fundamentally with what we're doing and almost would tell you, burn it down, let's default, let's let the country lose their lesson.
Right.
And while that sounds great, the repercussions, especially on people who can least afford it, would be catastrophic. It would be damaging to businesses and individuals alike and to the ag industry for sure. But generally speaking, the people who get hurt the worst are the people who are already suffering. And so cooler heads will prevail and something will be agreed upon. But the impact on ag, what our farm bill looks like and what some of the future endeavors look like, some of the things that we've achieved while authorized doesn't mean that they're funded. And that's kind of one of the dirty little secrets within Congress is you can pass whatever legislation you want to and authorize a program, but only certain programs are mandatory funding. Others are discretionary. Right. And so just because it got passed and authorized doesn't mean we have to fund it.
That's right. And it all comes down to the funding. All the hard work on policy and structure, Comes down to funding. Can we afford it? So, Sean McCarty, Director for Helena for Government Affairs, thanks for joining us here today in the FieldLink podcast studio and sharing some of the insight from Washington, some of the things happening on the Hill there in our great nation.
No, good time as always. I appreciate the time.
Bet. Thanks for joining us for this special episode of FieldLink. Be sure to download our podcast wherever you get your podcasts or follow us on our social media handles.